Brandon Finn within the SMARTA project, and you've been working with many of the similar aspects and ideas as we have in MAMBA, just in a slightly different geography, as I said, more towards the west and south of Europe. But luckily, SMARTA project is also continuing beyond MAMBA. So we'll try to merge all our knowledge here and also add to the SMARTA project, and maybe eventually form a new European network for rural mobility. How nice would that be? So Brandon, please take it away and tell us more about SMARTA and your findings when it comes to policy.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's try sharing the screen. And is that sharing?
Not yet, but maybe soon.
So maybe slow response time. Are we there?
We're starting. We're getting there. Looks good.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, thanks very much for having us here. My name is Brendan Finn. I'm the project manager with the SMARTA project, and with my colleagues Andrea Lorenzini and Giorgio Ambrosino at MEMEX, we've put together this presentation. But it also comes with a lot of input from our other colleagues within the SMARTA project. Now, why is that not advancing? Okay, this way. Core issue, I think that we're all agreed on. Mobility in rural areas needs attention. And if we take Europe, what we can see is that for all of things that we say about it and the rise of urban areas and so forth, the fact is that it is predominantly rural. Territorially, that is not going to change. It's always going to be predominantly rural, with a significant population in the rural areas. But we know there are the problems of depopulation, aging population, austerity measures, and so forth. And yet we have 27% of the population of Europe living in rural areas, 137 million people. That's a lot. But the same level of attention is not being paid to the transport policy or innovation or capital investment for rural mobility needs. So one of the things that the European Parliament did was they sponsored a project, SMARTA project, which is funded and managed by DG Move. And our website is there, ruralsharedmobility.eu. And the key thing was to look at ways of ensuring sustainable mobility by integrating or linking shared mobility solutions with the regular public transport in rural areas. Our consortium, 5 members, led by MEMEX of Italy, with Vectos in the UK, TML in Belgium, EI projects in Romania, and the University of Aberdeen. And we have 3 main strands of research, which will lead to recommendations and policy guidelines. The research is so-called insight papers, where we've looked at the framework in each of the EU member states and some neighboring countries. They're all published on our website. And we also looked at about 35 good practice cases. They're all individually documented on our website, and developed a brochure on good practice. We have a number of demonstration sites, which I'll mention in a moment, where various rural shared mobility services link in one way or another with the conventional transport service. And we have a fairly wide outreach through workshops, seminars, and in fact, we have a new set of thematic webinars beginning on the 14th of October, and our final conference will be on the 10th and 11th of December. And all of this, when we bring this together, is to bring about policy recommendations for rural mobility, targeted both at the European level, at the national level, and also towards practitioners and operators. We are working with a series of partners, and in yellow there you can see the ones that are directly within our project. Demand responsive transport, integrating with the regional transport in Kilkenny in Ireland, the Réseau Poussy hitchhiking in France, the volunteer bus, Burger bus in Germany, and the open door school bus in Tuscany, where regular members of the community can also use the school buses. Our sister project, SMARTA 2, there's e-bicycle sharing in Águeda in Portugal, e-car sharing in Estoril, and carpooling in Brașov in Romania, and Utricula in Greece, backed by various apps, and again, integrating with public transport. And we're also working with 5 other what we call good practice sites. 3 of are well known to you because they're from MAMBA project, in Vaila in Denmark, Vijima in Latvia, and Bielsko-Biala, which we've just seen the video, but also a mobility hub in Groningen, in Drenthe in Netherlands, and Valderrama in Spain, the shuttle service. And all of these are leading into our SMARTA evaluation framework, again, published on our website. And obviously, we look at the layer of mobility and accessibility. But along the lines of both what Linda and Maria had been talking about, we also want to understand what were the enabling factors for change, what was the implementation process, feasibility of strategies. So we take these individual demonstrations and say, what can we learn from them at a much higher level? Now, let me come back to the so-called insight papers, where we looked at the frameworks within each of the European member states within which the rural mobility sits. The financing, the policy, institutional, regulatory, and so forth. And if I just give some highlights, when we looked across all of the member states, we see that there's a near total absence of specific national policy for mobility in rural areas. There are different authority levels acting in the rural mobility. There are very few obligations at the national level to provide rural service or its funding. And organizational arrangements for rural shared mobility are weak. Now, that's not to say that the organizations that deliver them are weak, but rather the frameworks within which they sit. There's some really good work being done out there, but the frameworks are not conducive to developing rural shared mobility. And of course, this is a big problem for local communities who wish to act, because there isn't a framework in which they can actually get needed support. Now, again, in all this, we'd highlight that there are some regions and some local authorities who make policies and programs and do an excellent job, even if the national level neither mandates it nor particularly supports it. And then we said, okay, what's up? Oh yeah, okay, now we're moving. Just 3 highlights from the insight papers when we analyzed them. We said, what's the layer of government at which rural mobility is primarily determined? And we see that in a number of countries it's national, mostly it's at the state and the region, and then in the red you see where the municipality or the county does it. But what we can see basically is that apart from some of the smaller countries like my own, Ireland, generally speaking, it's at the regional or the county or the municipal level at which is the primary determinant of the rural mobility. So we then asked the million-dollar question. Is there a specific rural mobility or transport policy with objectives, targets, and responsibilities? And we find just one country in Europe, Latvia, where there is such a thing, but regrettably, they don't really have the money to finance it. There's a few with aspirational goals we aspire to, we will examine, we will find ways to, but it doesn't have any targets. And in the vast majority of Europe, there is not a specific mobility policy with targets and goals and objectives and responsibilities. So we said, okay, well, look, if there isn't at national level, it's the equivalent of the SUMP, the Sustainable Urban Mobility Policy. Again, Slovenia was the only country we find that actually has any structured approach to this. There's a few countries where some is being implemented, and I think it's a bit unfair in Belgium because actually in Flanders, it has now become widespread and they're probably the leader in this. But the reality is it's very little practice in Europe either. So neither at the national level nor at the regional level do we find a planning framework or a policy framework. So what does that lead us to? What is the problem? The problem is there's no policy for rural mobility at European level, nor is there any obligation for member states to have such a policy. Now, as a single European member state has a target-bound policy for rural mobility with assigned responsibilities and sufficient committed budget to deliver it. So that means it's left to regions and local areas to provide such services that they see fit, if they choose to, or just to do what they can within whatever limited resources have been allocated to them. So that leads us to the issues at the provision level that we all know. Limited public transport in rural areas, many areas have none, low frequency, which are timed for either commuting or shopping and don't suit other purposes, lack of structured integration with the conventional services, and few opportunities for people outside the region to get there without a car, so therefore they bring cars into the area. And at the personal level, we see very high dependency on cars. If you don't have a car, you're in trouble. Accessibility to public transport is a problem by distance, by road surface conditions, by lighting and so forth. And the low level of service makes connections with the regular transport difficult. And of course, the return trip may be impossible for you. And children usually have good level of access to school, but otherwise they're dependent on parents for lift giving. So they have less independence and it puts a heavy burden on households. So it's time to act, but why should the EU act on something that seems to be a local issue? Where's our case here? Well, the EU acts on policies on a whole series of areas, and at one level on the map, we see, yes, it's done at the European level, but actually all these policies must be implemented at the local level. And if you don't have mobility, it impacts on the ability to deliver on policy. The second aspect, though, is mobility is a basic freedom. We understand this in urban areas and most other things, but without mobility, you cannot access work or education or all the other things that are part of your daily life, and it's a vital enabler for rural communities. And if we think of rural areas as being a cluster of people, communities, and businesses and activities, without mobility, they're in trouble. And what we're finding, and we all know this over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen as a direct result of policy or an indirect result of policies, these are not happening by accident, increased centralization, so we have less local services, less jobs, shops, and activities. We've reduced financial support to rural mobility, and in socio-demographic terms, we see the young and the old stay and the middle leave. And this leads people to need to travel further for most purposes. Car is often the only option, with very few options available, and many people can't use cars due to age or infirmity. And that then has the consequence that people in the area have difficulty to live a daily life without a car. You get increased rural traffic, which not only affects the rural area, but also they converge in urban areas, leading to problems, and you're getting energy consumption and emissions going through the roof. However, one of the problems in trying to communicate this is when we show it on the video, people from outside tend to see these are the small people in small places, small problems. And okay, why should Europe act? And that's where we got to bring it back to the 137 million people. This is a quarter of Europe's population. And you have no hope of delivering on European level policies if you ignore that quarter. If they cannot participate, or their only means of participation is high energy and high emissions, you cannot deliver on your policies. So if we say Europe should act, in what way should it act? First of all, is to establish European-wide policies on rural mobility. And that means that rural mobility should be included across all policy areas, but most especially to recognize the linkage between rural mobility and climate change and energy issues. If we have a quarter of Europe's population traveling large distances dependent on cars, we cannot meet the targets. And the targets and obligations in national policies need to be migrated downwards to local development plans and programs with defined responsibilities for delivery. So that leads us to the second strand, is not only to have a European-wide policy, but to require member states to establish national policies on rural mobility. And the goal should be to have target-bound rural mobility policies in all member states by 2025 and effective frameworks in place by 2030. Quite doable, because it is at the local level, minimal infrastructure requirements, and the local communities can act, whether it be at the local government layer or the communities themselves, they can act once they have the framework to do so. It would be a matter for the individual member states what exactly is the coverage level, the allocation, and so forth. The point is, it cannot continue that there are neither mandated levels of service nor assigned responsibilities to assure their provision. So the European Parliament would mandate that by 2030, every part of the EU territory is covered by a mobility policy set at national or regional level, and a specific mobility plan that includes objectives, targets, and responsibilities, and that all of the national and regional territory will be covered by the policy. It would still remain the national or regional or local level decision as to what exactly is done. The point is they must do something. And just to close out, if I can remind why the EU needs to lead. Let's look at this slide again. For decades, the member states have had the competence and all of the needed skills and so forth to do this, but they have not done so. So it requires a push from the European level to say to the member states, look, guys, you need to do this. But the other thing to consider is, if I ask the question, is there a specific urban mobility transport policy with objectives, targets, and responsibilities, the entire map will be green. We can do it for rural areas. Thank you very much.